With everything going up in price, is the answer to all of the problems moving back to DDR3 and using a Haswell Core i5 in 2026? Right, so recently we picked up a Chill Blast gaming PC that was powered by a Haswell processor. The processor in question being this i5-4670K that I've finally removed from the system. Honestly, it doesn't look too bad. It's cleaned up alright. There was some very gunky thermal paste on it, but what I wanted to know was, how is this processor, this i5-4670K, actually holding up in 2026? So what happens if we take that exact same system, give it some upgrades, and find out how it's performing when we're just testing this? Because this is now, I mean, I don't actually know how much these cost, but let's get it whacked back in the system and do a few upgrades to give this its best chance possible. So this here is actually a fairly decent Z87 motherboard, which means that we've actually got a decent chance of testing this. But before we go any further, after we get this installed, how much actually do these cost? I mean, I bought this entire Haswell gaming system for about 50 quid. Right, this is not an expensive processor now. They are in stock for simply £6, which by extension does also mean you get to use DDR3, which is cheaper at the moment. And even in our last video where the system was heavily limited, I mean, we've got an old Kepler GTX 670, which we will look at. We only had 8 gigs of RAM, so this was not a best case scenario for the system, but we'll whack a cooler on here. I'm sure no one wants to see me fiddling about with that. It was this monumental chunk of a cooler, which means we can get away with some overclocking. It's got these little pins it's meant to attach on. Probably worth also mentioning, the cooler this has, which we are going to use for overclocking, has kept this thing so cold throughout the years that even today the thermal paste was still gooey. I don't even know if this is part of buying advice, but if you want to overclock these, well, they don't use soldering inside connecting the IHS. It's rare to find one that hasn't been cooked to death. So that is the one advantage we have of this cooler being on here, is the TIM inside will not have dried out because this thing is still running at 30 degrees idle and about 50 degrees under load. Is there an easier way to do this? Or is it just the pain and suffering is the recommended manufacturer's installation guide? What if we just use another cooler box? Now, it must be said, when it comes to Haswell, I have done very little testing. This is probably the second Haswell computer to feature on the channel, I believe. The first one being the cheap Alienware we got, but we've not moved that along from a Core i3. Hopefully we never actually upgrade the processor in this. Hopefully this video proves that we never have to upgrade the processor in this. This is just needlessly painful. Now, to give this thing the best chance possible, we're going to take out the Corsair Value RAM, and I picked up from CEX, but this is meant to be, at least according to my order, 16 gigs of 2400 megahertz DDR3. To give you an idea, even with the RAM, Crysis is the highest spec RAM you can buy. They've gone with a stupid name because the way they've written Viper looks like Nipper, but at the same time, the highest quality RAM you can buy for DDR3 costs you £16 for 16 gigabytes, which isn't terrible. So 16 gigabytes should be enough for testing today, makes it a real world relevant test. The only other issue with it being CEX RAM is there's a good chance this doesn't work. So we've got our i5 in there, massive cooler, new thermal paste, RAM's upgraded. All that's left to do is make sure it still boots up, and then we need to do something about the Spectre and Meltdown patches, which are also harming performance. So if we check CPU-Z, just double check everything in here is working, the next step is going to be overclocking. Oh, it has maintained our overclock settings. It is still running at 4.5 gigahertz. DRAM ratio, DRAM frequency. Now this is meant to be 2400 megahertz DDR3. Guessing by the reboots, this is not actually 2400 megahertz RAM. This is 1866 megahertz RAM. Overclocking failed. Yes, because it's not actually that RAM. I mean, the one advantage of this is I'd imagine most DDR3 can probably run at these speeds. Maybe with a little bit of tweaking, but most should handle 1866 absolutely fine. Still, this cost me the same price as normal RAM, so I can't even be that annoyed about it. It just would have been interesting to see. So I think we cover 4 results, which will be stock performance, overclocked with better RAM, and then overclocked with better RAM and Spectre and Meltdown removed, which gives you an idea of the base to the best kind of performance you could get from a 4670K, at least in the benchmarks, until we're getting into the main level of testing. Now, rather than poorly compiling my live edits together, it's better that we just recap this in post, and I show you exactly what I was doing. See, when I'm talking about testing this processor, I wanted to test it in all states that I possibly could, so this includes a stock test, an overclock test, both of these also done with higher RAM speeds, not exactly a huge RAM speed increase, but at least up to 1866 MHz, which virtually all sticks of DDR3 that are somewhat recent and somewhat decent should be able to do, and I've also gone through and tested it without the Spectre and Meltdown patches enabled, which isn't something that I've ever really dabbled with before, but these patches do actually cause some performance hindrance, even on platforms as new as Haswell. So I do think as we go forward with processor testing in the future, we are going to look at turning these off, purely just to see the performance benefits you get out of them. Because honestly, even running this at stock speeds, you are losing a good chunk of performance just by having these enabled, and I think the best way of me explaining this is you get close to what our processor is running at a 4.5 GHz overclock with them enabled by simply running it at stock speeds and disabling them. That's how big of a performance hit that I found out of these. Now, I have gone through and compiled all the data for this, but that's just what I was getting up to here, was going through, testing the processor in different states of tune to make sure that we could get the performance results we needed. And it's much easier explaining it like this than it is explaining it in a live manner. In terms of the graphics card we're utilising today though, just to get this section out of the way as well, rather than me explaining through very fumbly what I'm doing, we are running with a Radeon 6700 XT. That's right, an actual Navi 2 flagship, just to make sure that we are entirely CPU bound in all instances. Now, some people are going to say, this isn't very reminiscent of the test, why aren't you running something like what's already in the system, a GTX 670? Because then we're bound by the performance of the graphics cards of the era when the processor is capable of so much more. Part of one of the reasons about CPU testing that's so important is ensuring the CPU is always the limit, meaning that this is the maximum performance we can see it actually produce. And I will get more into the updated mythology that we're using today later on in the video, but what you need to know is we've taken out the GTX 670 and we replaced it with an actual Navi 2 flagship. We are giving this i5 possibly the best chance possible at actually returning us some decent performance, and this is the maximum performance you should be able to get out of it, even when you're looking at pairing it with a flagship that really is far too expensive, far too new, and far too powerful. I really don't know anyone that would making this combination of parts together, but the whole reason is to make sure we're limited by the processor. For some viewers of the channel though, they're probably wondering what is a 4670K. I mean, it's a Core i5 that I'm sure everyone's heard of, but there's some people that watch this channel that have probably got no clue what this actually is. Well, it launched back in 2013, meaning this is now a 13-year-old processor, and is often regarded as one of the last great Core i5 processors. I mean, at least one of the last great 4-core ones. At the time, it was decently well reviewed. I mean, it was up against AMD's FX processors, so it didn't exactly have strong competition, and this was peak Intel, giving you around 5% extra performance for a load more money than what you'd spent. It also operated on a new platform that does come with some newer features, such as better PCIe Express. It's also got better thermal management and better power management, but it's also when Intel started cheaping things out a little bit, so the internal heat spreader is connected via thermal paste rather than being soldered. Some people will have been delidding these back in the day, and that's one of the reasons why. There was some reviewers that did pick up on its very minor increases in performance over the previous generations, both of them included Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge, and as well as this, it also launched at a rather high price at the time. Now, as time's gone on, it's earned itself a bit of a legendary reputation, with most people that were still using these often just using them for years after they bought them, or getting them in hand-me-down or used systems, or, as time went on, cheaper OEMs and pre-built gaming PCs. So it's ended up with a good reputation of people still using these chips even to this day. It's one of those processors that is, it was okay on launch. It was an enthusiast chip because it's one of the K-series ones, which is why people bought it, but its longevity and the fact people are still using it means that even if it was expensive at the time, if you've got 13 years out of your processor, can you really be that annoyed at how much you spent on it at the time? Generally though, people aren't really talking about it too much today, but it has seen a recent resurgence given the massive increase in DDR5 and DDR4 pricing. DDR3 is included in this price hike, but to a much lesser extent as we've already touched on. Specifications-wise, it's not actually too bad even by today's standards. The Haswell architecture did offer a few improvements over Ivy Bridge and Sandy Bridge, but did also come with the downside that I've already touched on, that it wasn't a soldered processor, meaning overclocks were a bit more limited than they were meant to be. But still, you can look at getting around 4.5 to maybe 4.6 GHz if you're lucky out of one of these, provided thermals aren't a problem. They're based on the 22nm process, have 4 cores and 4 threads at 3.4 GHz, they come with a rather healthy 6 MB of L3 cache, and a rather decent TDP of around 84 watts. Keep in mind it does use less power than this, usually the same while overclocked. It released back in 2013, utilises DDR3, has turbo clocks enabled, meaning that even from the factory you should get boosting around 3.7 to 3.8 GHz. It has an iGPU, the Intel HD 4600 I believe, and launch around £200 or $248. Today though, these processors go from anywhere from £5 to £10, and a lot of the time you'll get them in used gaming PCs like I have, where I've got a Chill Blast unit. Now, some people did say Chill Blast back in the day did get binned processors, meaning that my unit didn't really have any problems actually hitting a 4.5 GHz overclock on around 1.2 volts or something around that sort of mark. It was 1.27 volts, which is a pretty decent and pretty standard overclock on one of these. So at the end of the day, not bad specifications, but 4 cores really doesn't go very far, or maybe that's just something people want you to believe. Being a K-series processor though, and I have already spoken about this briefly, there are advantages to overclocking this processor, but what I've done already is I've gone through 3D marking the time-spy physics test and got us a load of results together to see just what kind of states the processor can be in to return you different levels of performance. Keep in mind this is actually very reminiscent of real gameplay and real workload tasks, which is why I kind of like using this test for testing processors. One of the main things you're going to notice here is that by disabling the Spectre and Meltdown patches, you do get a sizable increase in performance. RAM being increased to 1866 MHz gives you around 50 points extra, but a lot of increase can be seen just by disabling those patches, so it's something you haven't done, and you've looked into the security risks, which if you're just a personal user on your own computer and not someone running a data center, actually aren't too bad, then it should be something you could probably look into doing. Generally, overclocking nets you a sizable performance, go from 3055 up to 3573, but then again, running it without patches only puts you 200 points shy of this in the first place. Long story short, if you've got a K-series, the best way of running this is how we're running it today. We've got slightly overclocked RAM, which most RAM should be able to do, we're running it with patches disabled, and we're running it overclocked, netting us a really rather decent score of 3805. I mean, it's not exactly comparing great to modern processors, but it's doing okay, coming just shy of the Ryzen 3 3100, which is a Zen 2 chip, and something that I still consider to be relatively modern, as I know quite a few people still using them that haven't wanted to upgrade. It's also worth noting that, given that that is a processor that people are still buying, well, it shows you that it is still comparable to a 2013 Core i5, just one that's been set up properly. Now, when it comes to the methodology of testing these processors, I have updated it as we move into 2026 because I do love testing processors, but it is certainly a daunting and time-consuming task given how many variables there are and just how many different methods there are to actually getting it all to work. You can't seem to make everyone happy. So what I've done is, for most benchmarks, we are going to be testing them at their highest possible settings because in a lot of more recent games, a lot of the graphical settings will put a lot of strain on the processor and can reduce your overall performance. So how we're going to be doing the benchmarks today is we're going to be testing most games with their maximum possible settings to see if the processor is still capable of ultra or high settings, and then we are going to be testing them with either the lowest settings possible to see the maximum frame rate the processor can produce, or in certain cases the optimal setup, which may involve tweaking to show that the Core i5 can actually still run some titles. So we're going to be trying to do this as fair as possible. We're going to look at it of, can it run AAA titles with ultra settings still? Can it still manage AAA titles? And in some cases, does tweaking things around mean that it can still run games properly? So we're going to make this a very fair test where we aren't going to be looking at it with all the high settings in all games and go, oh, look, it can't run it properly because it's a processor from 2013, and if it's still a viable choice with a few reduced settings, that's something worth noting. Either way, it's taken a lot of time to get all of these benchmarks done, so it's worth finding out, is the Core i5 4670K completely obsolete? in the benchmarks. Starting things off, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition running with the highest options and the ultra ray tracing preset enabled, so this is about as intensive as this game can go. And it definitely does have a toll on the processor, with it now averaging around 41 FPS overall, with 1% lows down to 34 FPS. Now it's worth keeping in mind this is a recent release and one that does actually scale well across more cores, so restricting it down to just 4 cores, admittedly highly clocked and set up ones, does net you, well, some rather lackluster performance. It's not the worst thing in the world at the end of the day, because if you did want to play it with these settings, I'm not sure why you've got a graphics card that can manage these settings in a Core i5, but you never know, you could cap this to 30 FPS and you'd be absolutely fine. On the other hand, if you run this with just normal settings, and that's sort of just the game at its bare minimum, you can see the game now runs at 124 FPS on average, with incredibly stable 1% lows down to 114 FPS. So it is worth noting that this processor is still more than capable of running this game at well into the hundreds of FPS. It's just a case of some of those settings are now going to be so intensive that, well, they are certainly going to net you around a third of the frame rate compared to what you'd get with just low settings across the board. But GTA 5 Enhanced Edition works absolutely fine, provided, well, you're going to go with a 30 FPS cap, or you're going to play the game with lower settings. Moving over to the world of GTA Online, and things certainly are a bit interesting here, because it's a bit of a weird one, because there is actually less going on from a processor perspective during the online bits of gameplay. There's less to process, there's other things happening server side, and yes, there could be more players, but in the Enhanced Edition, well, you don't get the lack of utilization you do back in Legacy. We saw 48 FPS on average, which is an increase over single player, with 1% lows now down to 37 FPS, so it was actually a better experience playing online. It's also worth noting that when I was midway through the benchmark, a ton of people left the server, so if you're wondering how this runs when about 30 people leave, you gain around 10 FPS, now putting you just shy of 60 FPS, even with these very high settings and ray tracing enabled. If you drop this back to normal settings, however, your frame rate doubles on average, now seeing 82 FPS overall, with 1% lows down to 76 FPS. So it's worth keeping in mind that if you were looking for a full 60 FPS experience online, you aren't going to be managing with high settings plus the ultra settings enabled on ray tracing. But still, it's good to know that it can still max out this game, both single player and online, and we're not going to be focusing too much on older titles because, let's be honest, they've been covered to death over the years, but to give you a reminder of how GTA 5 the Legacy version runs completely maxed out with AMD CHS Shadows, we saw 88 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 63 FPS. Kinda makes sense, GTA 5 was designed with these processors in mind, so it's no surprise that you're seeing well over 60 FPS with settings well beyond what you'd imagine your average system was running back in the day, and you're getting absolutely fine performance. So yes, it is certainly more intensive running the Enhanced Edition, but it can still do it. Moving on to Oblivion Remastered, which we ran with the high preset at first, and everything seemed okay once it had loaded in. It did take an awful long time to load in, and you do get a warning that 4 cores isn't enough for this game. And really, that seems to be the case. We did see an average of 37 FPS, but the game would regularly lock and hitch up and freeze. And some people are probably thinking that's because you're only running 16GB of RAM. Well, I went back through the system, and I added another 8GB of RAM that will also run at 1866 MHz, and it made absolutely no difference now that we had plenty of RAM in the system. So for some reason, Oblivion Remastered just didn't want to run on this system. I did try moving things over to low with a 30 FPS cap in place, and it was the same story. Even with an increased amount of RAM, low settings, and a 30 FPS cap, it would run fine and then hitch up for a few seconds, and this would just carry on, and sometimes the hitches would get longer, sometimes they were shorter. Actually, the best way I found of playing it was with low settings and then FSR set to quality mode, and this seemed to just sort of average it out to a nearly playable level, but then it would lock up again. So Oblivion Remastered on a 4-core i5, well, we do revisit this later on. I've got an experiment for later on in the video, I'm not going to ruin it here, but as it stands through these benchmarks, just wasn't playable. Now, this is the type of title that people would likely be picking up or building a Core i5 system of this era for, and it is going to be for stuff like Counter-Strike 2, where it could be a cheap and affordable way into getting a rather competitive machine. And as it stands, with competitive settings, we saw 198 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 166 FPS, and those are some really rather decent frame times, and it's worth noting that these benchmark figures are taken from the overall benchmark, the built-in workshop one, and also from real gameplay. So it's worth noting that we saw the exact same figures as this, even in newer maps. We were entirely CPU bound all the way through, because, I mean, this graphics card can manage a lot more than this, but if you did want to move up to higher settings, you do take a noticeable hit down to 160 FPS overall, with 1% lows now being slightly worse than they were before, going down to 126 FPS. So it's not too bad, but you can play Counter-Strike 2 pretty much absolutely fine, and this does check out because the person I know using a Ryzen 3 3100, which returns very similar performance to this, is doing absolutely fine on their processor and regularly uses it for Counter-Strike on a high refresh FreeSync monitor. So it's worth noting that this is not a bad idea if you're looking for a system to throw together for Counter-Strike. Decently high FPS, but you're probably better off sticking to competitive settings just to keep your frame times more in check. Cyberpunk 2077 certainly is an interesting one because it is one of those games that, with higher settings, does come more demand on the processor. So how does the game run with high settings and high options enabled with ray tracing? Well, we saw around 36 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 27 FPS, which were mostly from the start of combat or getting in a vehicle, where the quickly changing camera angle or explosions or just the attraction of NPCs would cause you a momentary dip in the overall frame rate. Overall, it wasn't anything unplayable, but really a 30 FPS cap here would have helped if you are looking to run the game with these types of settings. For some people wondering if maybe going down to a lower set of settings could enable you to get 60 FPS, it's not really the case on even this well set up Core i5. With low settings we saw 57 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 38 FPS. So yes, it was a smoother experience, and as someone utilising a FreeSync monitor it wasn't too bad, but you would still get those momentary hitches at the start of combat and when getting into a vehicle that just aren't there on slightly newer processors. But still, Cyberpunk 2077 will still work. Maybe a 30 FPS cap and higher settings is recommended here, but at the same time, you're still going to be able to play it on a 2013 Core i5. BeamNG is a bit of an interesting one to benchmark because there's multiple things putting load on the processors, so I've gone ahead and done 3 tests here showing the highest settings you'll be able to run the game at and the frame rate you'll get, which is what we'll start with. Ultra settings returns you 59 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 53 FPS, but it's worth noting this does put quite a heavy strain on the processor just from graphical settings alone. Once again, if you've not already noticed, we are running most games in a lower resolution to ensure we're entirely CPU bound, and even in these instances, well, the processor is still working harder than the graphics card a lot of the time. You'll also notice this game can be single-threaded in areas, meaning that some parts of the processor are working harder than other ones are. If you're running the maximum frame rate you could possibly achieve in BeamNG with the lowest settings, it is around 228 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 215 FPS. Now, it's worth noting this is completely overkill, so I don't know why you'd be targeting a 240Hz monitor-style frame rate, but your game would have to look like this to do it. Really, the most optimal way of playing the game, and this is probably one that puts some real load on the processor that's a practical use case, is with medium and high settings, plus all of the traffic enabled, and the chase mode enabled as well, which is putting constant load on the processor. You can probably see up there in the top left, it's always working at 100%, even on this jungle map, because, well, there's lots of NPCs around there trying to find you, and there's, lots just happening. It also means the game looks alright as well, so this is probably the best compromise of settings you're going to be able to manage, as if you do try ultra settings with all of this enabled, you're looking at sub 30 FPS in certain places. So really, medium and high, all the traffic enabled, it'll handle it, and it can be quite CPU intensive, so it does well enough here. This may very well be the first time we've ever done Fortnite on a processor benchmark. In case anyone actually does know if I've ever tested this before in the past on a processor, please do let me know in the comments because I cannot remember testing it. But still, with the game running with very high settings in DirectX 12, we returned 101 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 87 FPS, which at first sounds fantastic, right? We're running this game completely maxed out and seeing 100 FPS on average. Well, the reason for this is, there's so much going on that even if you leave the game game just running. It very rarely actually decides to load in any textures, so it's a bit tricky to actually figure out what's going on because a lot of the time things you're looking for won't actually load in with these settings. And this can be seen by dropping down to low settings, where our frame rate now drops, but that's because it's actually loaded in some textures, with 98 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 78 FPS. If you're wondering how you should play this game on a Core i5, well, really, unless you want to be losing out on all the textures existing all over the place, the best way is probably to play the game with very high settings, DirectX 12 enabled, and a 60 FPS external cap, which I did through MSI Afterburner, which meant the game looked good with all of the textures actually now loading in. It gave you some spare CPU time that if anything more intensive happened you wouldn't get frame drops, and it now stayed at a pretty much constant 60 FPS after everything had loaded in, returning as 59 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 57 FPS. So really, for your most optimized settings, look at a 60 FPS cap externally, otherwise you're looking at, well, you can play it with low settings if you're targeting it, but the frame times here at 60 FPS just felt smoother and more pleasant. Running Rust was a bit of a weird one because these results are taken from a mixture of actual gameplay and the built-in benchmark, so it gives you a good average of the game at its most intensive and also how you're actually playing the game. With the very high preset, we saw 68 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 49 FPS, which to me seems pretty decent and about what I'd expect from Rust, to be honest. Moving down to low settings, and honestly, to my eyes, I couldn't actually see all too much of a difference. I know it is there when you go up and inspect things more closely, but at the same time we saw it nearly double our frame rate, up to 102 FPS on average, with 1% lows now down to 79 FPS. So if you're looking for more of a 60 FPS experience, maybe consider capping the game with low and medium settings, and you'd probably get away with the most optimal experience when it comes to playing Rust. At the end of the day though, it can still manage it with very high settings, and this was on quite a populated server with a decent chunk going on. Baldur's Gate 3 is a bit of a weird one because we are testing with an AMD graphics card, and this game certainly does have more intensive areas than what I'm showing here. Unfortunately, I've not played through the game enough to actually get to those areas, but I'm sure at some point this year I will get around to it. As it stands, this is in line with how we usually benchmark the game, and with high settings we saw 67 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 50 FPS. There was the occasional bit of GPU spiking, but it didn't change the fact our processor was pretty much always at 100% usage, and to be fair, this isn't actually too bad of a result overall. It's worth noting though that dropping down to low settings did net us an improvement in the frame times, but actually saw a lower average overall, so it's a bit of a tricky one to say here because the graphical settings of this game don't seem to make all too much of a difference to how the game runs. I'm sure when it comes to turn calculations and things like that, it'll make more of a difference, but when it comes to the actual visual fidelity, well, the settings aren't putting too much of a strain on the processor. The game in general just is keeping this at 100% utilization. Hitman is actually a rather good example of how some games can be really rather intensive on the processor when you start turning settings up. With low settings and the base simulation, which does have an effect on both the processor and the graphics card, keep in mind, we saw 100% FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 74 FPS during the Dartmoor benchmark map, which is one of the more intensive options there, and keep in mind most maps and most gameplay would actually result in a higher frame rate than this overall. When you start moving things up though, with high settings and the best simulation mode enabled, everything seems okay at first until the benchmark really kicks off, where we now saw an average of 25 FPS with 1% lows down to 12 FPS. On occasion the game was in single digits. Keep in mind though, it didn't freeze, hitch up or lock up at all. This is just purely how intensive the game can be on a 4-core processor when you're asking it for the best simulation results, with lots of the fancy effects turned on. I'm sure you could find a happy medium here with the base simulation mode and maybe medium and high settings on a bit more of a well paired together system. At the same time though, Hitman will work, but you're not going to be playing it with the best settings there are out there. Mount & Blade Bannerlord does actually scale the battle size with the settings you use, which means that it can be rather intensive on the processor when you start turning things up. Very high settings was playable with 75 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 39 FPS, however there was some quite heavy stuttering when there was lots of soldiers on screen, and this was all down to the 4-core processor. It's worth noting that if you were just playing a lot of the early to mid game, and even some of the early late game, you'd likely be able to get away with these settings before you start getting the hitching and stuttering. If you're wondering how this game runs with its lows preset, well, you're now seeing 191 FPS overall, with 1% lows down to 166 FPS. Really though, this isn't the kind of game that you need to play with these settings, so if you are going to play this game, the most optimal way to play it on one of these older 4-core i5s is with a mixture of high and very high, the high battle size option enabled, and a 60 FPS cap. This kept things a lot smoother overall, and saw our frame times now down to just 55 FPS. So for this battle's very reminiscent of the late game, and you're getting pretty much no problems whatsoever. So the Core i5, even with just 4 cores and no hyper-threading, can manage this game if you're willing to set it up properly. PUBG was a major problem when we went and actually tested the system as a whole last week, and one of the reasons that it was a problem is that we just couldn't get the game running smoothly, and I blamed it on the RAM. But turns out there's a lot more happening here than just the RAM being at fault, because now we have 24 gigabytes of it running at high speeds, and it's still not running right at any settings we chose. It didn't matter what settings we were running at, we'd get around 46 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 34, and a lot of hitching and stuttering in places that never calmed down or went away. How did I get around this though? Well, we could run the game with any settings we wanted, low all the way up to very high, and we had to do a few tweaks. For example, we had to run the game with a 70 FPS cap internally, a 60 FPS cap externally, and we'd also have to set the processor to high priority for this game. And then suddenly the game went from being unplayable to now a pretty much fluent and locked 60 FPS from anywhere with low settings up to ultra settings. So this is a bit of a weird one. PUBG, I've heard, does have major problems on 4-core processors these days, so yes, it will still run for you, but you're going to have to probably utilize these tweaks. 70 FPS cap in game, 60 FPS cap externally, high priority in Task Manager, and you're pretty much good to go. For lots of people wondering about the original Source engine, which doesn't really utilize more than 2 cores a lot of the time, we have Black Mesa here, which is probably one of the most intensive Source games there is out there, so if it can run this, it can likely run any Source game you want. With ultra settings on the Zen test map, we saw 139 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 98 FPS. As you can see, utilization is a bit weird on the core-to-core basis, but at the same time, it does go to show that virtually any Source game you want to run will run completely fine. And the Source engine games, they do have an effect with the settings you choose on the processor, but not as much as new titles do, so it's one that's worth keeping in there for the sake of in case you want to play these types of games, but they will work fine. A personal choice I wanted to add with Rimworld, just to see how it's getting on now we've actually tuned up this Core i5 to run its most optimal settings possible, and running a small colony on a normal sized map running with the 3x speed saw the game at a fully locked 60 FPS. Once again, with Rimworld it doesn't really matter what frame rate you're getting, it's the internal tick rate that matters. I could definitely see this being a problem as you progress through into the late game, as Rimworld has become a lot more multi-threaded since the v1.6 update. At the same time though, this does mean that for a lot of the early to mid game, and possibly on smaller maps and smaller colonies, you should be able to get away with speeding the game up with no problems. So it's one that's worth including because a lot of games like this, Rimworld, Civilization, Software Inc., Project Zomboid, those types of games where you're relying on, there's sort of just the game running and the internal tick rate of the game keeping up, you're not really looking at all too many problems until you really start stressing things out. But finally, can it run Crysis? I don't know how much of a relevant test this is, because I really don't think Navi deals with this particularly well. In fact, the Nvidia cards of this era deal with it even worse, so really you're better off running an older graphics card for a real Crysis benchmark. But in case you were wondering how a Haswell Core i5 and a sort of new flagship graphics card are handling this game, you're seeing ultra settings plus DirectX 10 returning 61 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 48 FPS. Crysis Crysis only really utilizes 2 cores, and as you can probably see from the processor utilization, it only really utilizes 1 core more than the others. So if you're wondering how pretty much single core IPC does, well, Crysis with ultra settings, which does put a decent chunk of load on the processor and does actually render some physics effects utilizing it. I say render, it processes them using it. You can still return 60 FPS, but during intensive situations like our benchmark scene, you are liable to go under this with a brand new graphics card. So, overall performance of the Core i5-4670K, and this is my first time actually properly sitting down and using a Haswell processor, at least a Core i5 one, and actually taking a proper look at it, because yes, I suppose we've looked at the Core i3 and that Alienware a while ago, but we never actually sat down to make a dedicated video on it like we are today. And performance is still hanging in there. I mean, of course, brand new titles that come up and tell you, we recommend a 6-core processor, well, they're not lying. Oblivion Remastered just is not happy, at least with the setup we've got here, there's more coming on that, when you try and run it on something like this. Even with the clock speed, even with the tweaks, even with trying to change the game down, it just isn't happy and results in constant frame drops. It's nothing to do with the RAM, it's nothing to do with the graphics card, it is mostly down to the processor, and there are things you can do to mitigate it, but at the same time, the game is expecting 2 more cores that simply aren't here. The same goes for issues in games that have received updates over the years, like Fortnite and PUBG, where they do now give you some issues on 4-core processors that they never used to give, where most people have moved away from these types of things. Fortnite's issues are mostly just it struggling too much to load in very high textures and do a high frame rate at the same time, which you can easily mitigate with a frame rate cap or lower settings. Then again, PUBG is just completely weird now on 4-core processors. It used to run fine on, I mean, even I used to play this on a Skylake i3 and it was fine, but now we've got to the point where the 4 cores, the game is just simply trying to do too much with, I'm guessing, a very forced attempt at multi-threading, that it means that for these processors you do have to do tweaking. But if you don't mind doing those tweaks in modern games or games that have been updated, you're getting on fine with these. I mean, Cyberpunk, I'd be more than happy to play this with a 30 FPS cap and ultra settings and ray tracing, and it would be fine. Counter-Strike is a golden example of where this process is good. You can pick this up for a $5 and get nearly 200 FPS with competitive settings, and it's not even going to set you back too much. You might spend, what, half an hour setting it up properly? At the same time, that is good processor performance. Yes, the lack of hyperthreading is a problem, yes, the lack of cores is a problem, but when you actually take a step back and look at it, this is a £5 processor. This is something that you can pick up for nothing these days. It is something that was once a very expensive CPU that has hung on there for years to the stage where it's in bargain bin territory, and it's still carrying on going. So, I do have to give it a bit of respect there. The performance that we got out of this is certainly more than adequate for most people. But the thing is, I wanted to know something. See, I really did believe that Oblivion Remastered must be able to run on this processor in some fashion. I've seen people trying to get it to work on Core 2 quads. There is no way that a 4670K should not be able to run this game at least to some capacity. There's got to be something we can do. And this is where I thought, what if we go with something that is maybe an older graphics card, still something powerful, but just something that's got less driver overhead, something that was designed to run on processors of a different era, and maybe it'll give it more of a chance. So I've recorded a clip, and this was a little experiment towards the end, to find out if maybe you could improve performance by giving this processor a worse graphics card. Right, so we've done most of the testing now, but there is something I was quite curious about. And as you probably noticed, we're on the AMD modded drivers webpage downloading some modded drivers. It's telling me to do an IQ test. And there is just something I wanted to see, which is, what if we put in a worse graphics card? Now, I'm not exactly going to say it's going to change performance, but I am curious to see if maybe some of those games that had issues, say like Oblivion Remastered, might work when they're matched with a more balanced graphics card. Because let's be honest, most titles, as we've just seen, worked fantastically on here. Yes, with newer titles, you did end up having to run FPS caps to stop things going a bit unstable, and yes, there were some games that were a bit funny like PUBG, but generally, for a well, what, £5-6 processor, this is some really solid and usable performance. But there is just the question of, if you're going to pair it with something that's maybe a bit more realistic than a 6700 XT, does the downgrade in power and a more balanced system because of it actually net you sometimes better performance? I doubt it, but it's something that I was really curious to test before we rounded off this video. And for this, I'm thinking of putting in the R9 Nano. Because let's be honest, it does run virtually all games that are out there. It's small, it's low power. You can't get one of these cheap, but you can get the big boy, like an R9 Fury, the actual full-sized one, for about 30 to 50 quid at the moment, which would be an ideal pairing on a system like this. Not that I think it would just about fit in this case, if you really tried. I mean, let's be honest, this is probably a more realistic pairing. You're going to be looking at pairing with something like this, maybe a GTX 1060, RX 480, RX 580, those types of cards with it, because they're all in sort of the bargain bin territory. But I wanted to test something that is a bit flagshipy. I mean, wouldn't it be interesting, though, if this actually does prove a little bit of a point that maybe you can go too far? Oblivion I just couldn't get working on here properly. I hope people have enjoyed the benchmarks, because you've probably already seen them at this point, and it's taken a long time to get all of that benchmarking done, especially on newer titles where, you know, I mean no disrespect to some channels that do this, but they will start a game, and if it doesn't work, they'll go, oh, that's a shame, didn't work. Well, is there any settings or tweaks or configs you can use to make it work on this processor? Does capping the frame rate work? Does setting the priority higher change anything? Does changing graphics card mean that you can finally play those games? You can't just go into this with the perspective of launch the game, see if it works, if it doesn't work, that's it. Because at the end of the day, people buying these are people that are willing to utilize these tweaks in order to play these games, because they've not got the money to spend on an alternative. I know I'm probably sound like I'm ranting here, but that's probably one of the reasons why I put so much effort into the benchmarks, is so people can actually take a look at this and go, you know what, maybe my Haswell i5 is a good idea still, or maybe for someone that is looking at this as an option, maybe they can look at it and go, actually, that could be good enough. And we know for a fact, because we did look at the Fury, what, a week ago, 2 weeks ago? And this is actually more powerful than that this is a solid graphics card that can still run a lot of modern titles while also not exactly being particularly heavy on the CPU, because it's running such lightweight drivers. We're not even going to worry about installing the AMD overlay or anything like that. We just want basic drivers on here, increase the power limit. We're not even going to undervolt things today. We just want this to run at maximum power, maximum usage, just a bog standard quick test, so I can know if maybe I'm not going completely insane, and maybe this graphics card, well, maybe the graphics card was too powerful. If this does work, it's going to make CPU testing even more of a pain on this channel than it already is. I love testing processors, it's great fun to do, and I've been meaning to get into testing Haswell for a while, but with a graphics card, it's pretty cut and dry. You make sure the system it goes into is running an up-to-date operating system, you tweak the graphics card to get the maximum power out of it, and you make sure you're not bottlenecked by the CPU. When it comes to testing processors, there's a lot more limitations than what version of DirectX are you running. There could be absolutely no performance change, because it must be said, I've had no problems with the drivers on the 6700 XT. Right, so it does appear that some degree of the lag we were getting in Oblivion is to do with the type of graphics card we were using. Once again, this is a terrible, terrible, terrible example, because the Nano just has so many problems with this game. Yeah, this is a much smoother experience with low settings than what we were getting on a 6700 XT, while also utilising the system in the exact same way. So this adds a new complication to processor testing. Using a graphics card that's too good will introduce some performance problems that you wouldn't actually think you would have had even when utilising low settings and the same frame rate cap. So yeah, turns out some of our processing issues, at least in Oblivion, and I wouldn't be surprised in other games like PUBG, are down to the type of graphics card we use. Haswell, despite supporting all of the latest and greatest PCI Express generations and things like that, has problems utilising the power because it's almost too much for the platform. Well, at least we got that testing done. It's useful to see that Oblivion, partially the responsibility of the graphics card being too good for the system. It is kind of useful to know. There really is very little else to say. When it comes to thermals and power consumption, it's not really too different from the last time we looked at this, which was actually in the computer itself. I mean, thermals-wise, we've changed the thermal paste, but it wasn't really too much of a problem last time, so you're looking at anywhere from 60 to 70 degrees overclocked under full load, at least with one of these giant coolers of the era, and you're looking at it running, well, with stock settings, around 50 to maybe 55 degrees with something of this size. Power consumption when it's overclocked is somewhere around 50 to 70 watts, which isn't too bad. I'm sure you really could push these harder if you did do a D-lid and then push a load more voltage into it, but as it stands, you're not going to be doing that unless you're really setting out to do that. I mean, the average person isn't going to be doing that with one of these. At the same time, what else is there? I did some basic OBS recording, and yeah, it can still get away with it. If you're looking at doing 1080p 30 FPS in older titles, it can still get away with recording enough, well, good enough for actually being used as playback on YouTube, or maybe just about okay if you're going to be doing some streaming. It's nothing fantastic, but it can do it. Let's be honest though, chances are if you're pairing this with any graphics card, you'll be utilising AMD VCE, Nvidia NVENC, or Intel's QuickSync, or whatever they call it now, QSV. At the same time, that's probably a better option if you're looking at this for media work. I did try and do some media work on it. I did some editing, I did some handbrake, I did a few little bits and pieces like that, and yeah, it can still edit, provided you're using period correct software. If you start utilising modern stuff, it does struggle a little bit without a good enough graphics card in there for it to fall back to, but when you're doing just basic CPU side editing, well, Haswell's still really quite good at it, especially with its single core boosting, which means that you're pretty much in for a good time. It's not a bad processor for day-to-day usage and is very speedy with an SSD. This Samsung unit in here really needs a firmware to achieve its full speeds, yet I had no problems with it being snappy enough. So yeah, it's a good processor, it'll handle most things, it doesn't use too much power, and it doesn't run too hot, provided your unit hasn't already been cooked to death before you bought it. So there we have it, the legendary Core i5-4670K. And what are my thoughts overall on the processor? Well, I think for a $5, or in my case, at the type of system you'd get these in, which is around £50 to £60 gaming PCs from the last decade, I don't think with the prices on the market right now you can really go too wrong for it. I mean, if you're someone that's just looking into getting a gaming computer, sure it is a bit of a dead end because your only real move from here is a Core i7-4770 or 4770K, and at the same time, yes, you can get these as Xeons if maybe you couldn't find one of the Core i5s. I know they're a lot cheaper on AliExpress, so for people in certain regions, yes, you can get a Xeon that performs like this. At the same time though, for most people, as long as you don't mind playing brand new games at a capped frame rate, either 60 or 30 FPS, and as long as you don't mind dealing with some oddities like PUBG or especially Oblivion Remastered, which is an Unreal Engine 5 title, which is where I'm placing the blame, it's not bad at all. So it's a bit of a tricky one, isn't it? Because the main reason why I'm saying this isn't too bad is because the market's gone the way it has. DDR4 has got very expensive, I do have some content coming on that soon. DDR5 doesn't exist for the average person anymore, so DDR3 is making a comeback. And it means that these old computers, well, they're still hanging in there, and they're doing absolutely fine for the actual games people are playing. Yes, there are some brand new titles that will struggle and you'll need 30 FPS caps, but for the games people are actually playing on the Steam Top 100, you're looking at pretty decent settings or pretty decent frame rates, and we've done the testing to prove that you can manage a good combination of both depending on your preference. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. It has been a monumental load of work with the new form of CPU testing we're doing, but I think we've covered a lot, so thank you all very much for watching, and good night.